Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Stat Plus conversation. This is a weekly video chat series exclusively for Stat Plus subscribers, and thanks for joining us. I'm Matthew Herper, senior writer for medicine and editorial director of events here at Stat, and in just a few moments, I'll be joined by Stat co-founder and executive editor Rick Berg. But first, a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a few icons. Use the chat feature to chat amongst yourselves and to send a message directly to the Stat team. Please note that we'll not be taking questions directly from the chat. But if you do have a question, and we hope you do, please use the Q&A feature to type it out, and we'll try to answer it live. You'll also be able to see the questions that other attendees have asked, upvote the questions you'd most like to have answered, and we will be paying attention to those upvotes. We will be taking your questions throughout our conversation, so start asking them now. There's no need to hold off. And before we get started, the sponsor of Stat Plus Conversations for the month of August is Premier. With that, I'd like to welcome Lee Anderson, President of Performance Services at Premier, for a brief recorded introduction.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lee Anderson, President of Performance Services at Premier Inc. And thank you for tuning into Stat Plus Conversations. And this is a very important conversation around an issue that has caused much conversations over the last several years. People in healthcare are constantly asking themselves how we as an industry can do better. For 14 years in a row, Premier has been recognized as world's most ethical companies by Ethisphere, a global leader in defining and advancing the standards of ethical business practices. Premier has been recognized for its efforts to understand the importance of leading, making hard but value-based decisions, and its overall commitment to integrity. Premier is dedicated to the healthcare segment. Today, we are working with 4,400 US hospitals and health systems and roughly 225,000 other providers, leveraging a data set unmatched in the industry. This history, our clinical expertise, our data, and our current technological footprint puts us in a unique position to do things better. Earlier this month, we were thrilled to announce we are branding our data and AI-enabled technology and services under a new platform that will accelerate ingenuity in healthcare. We're calling it Pink AI. Backed by the unparalleled data set, Pink AI will accelerate ingenuity in healthcare. Our data, analytics, and clinical intelligence capabilities combined are highly differentiated, driving value to providers and advancing innovation quickly and collaboratively with life sciences, carriers, and employers.
All right. Thank you very much, Lee. Now I'd like to introduce our boss, Rick Berg, the co-founder and executive editor here at Stat. Welcome, Rick, and you're going to take over from here and ask me.
Hi, Matt. Yep. Great to see you. And I have so much to ask you, particularly about your two interviews way back when with Elizabeth Holmes and what she was like and what that whole relationship was like. But before we do that, I want to sort of ask you a basic question, which is, beyond the salaciousness of this whole upcoming trial, why is this so important in our world of health and medicine? What are the implications here?
Well, I think Theranos resonates for a bunch of reasons, but one of the reasons this is important now is that what Holmes did was really push the hype cycle, the spin that normally comes. There's a lot of sizzle and self-promotion that goes into creating biotech companies and raising money. It's just it's part of the game. But she pushed that to another level where it was completely disconnected from reality. So what we see day in, day out when we cover biotech and diagnostics and drug companies is kind of people testing the line of what's acceptable. So I think it's important that what we know about Theranos, that what happened here is not acceptable. And I think that's one thing the industry is really going to be looking for from this trial. The other is that it gets to a big health issue, which is that people kind of want there to be a test for everything, and maybe on some level a pill for everything. And even pills, certainly, but even tests have risks that you don't want to be getting a lot of false positive tests. You don't necessarily want to make it easy for people to get diagnostic tests. And so there are a lot of big important health issues that came along. And then, of course, there's the question of how these things should be regulated. And, you know, the old maxim of "in God we trust, everyone else bring data," right? Like that was not followed well here. And that's certainly a really big deal in healthcare.
Do you see this whole case as a setback for the sort of the efforts by, as our colleague Casey Ross reported about, sort of the break versus the slower pace of healthcare development? Do you see this as a setback where people in the health world are going to be even more cautious, or have been more cautious?
It depends what else we learn, what other details we learn, and whether there are more salacious details. We've learned a lot. Theranos was certainly a setback for companies raising money, although companies have raised a lot of money from a lot of VCs since. I mean, these checks just keep getting bigger and bigger. When Elizabeth Holmes raised hundreds of millions of dollars, that was unheard of. And now I feel like we see that every week or two. We see some company, you know, this week there was a biotech that raised a $440 million Series B. So in a strange way, I think it was good, because it set boundaries, and it set expectations, and it set an idea that, you know, before the climate around unicorns, not just in healthcare, but regardless, but before Theranos and WeWork, there was this sense of inevitability about a lot of them. People had seen Facebook become this juggernaut, and they kind of thought, if the smart money put that much money into something, it had to be true. And that was one of the tough things about Theranos as a story, was that was kind of the common sense, I think, in business journalism at the time. And Theranos is this great resounding example of that is absolutely not true, that a lot of people who you'd think of as smart money put a lot of money into something that was completely untested.
Now, Matt, you wrote a story on October 15th, 2015 for Forbes with the headline, "Holmes needs to stop complaining and answer big questions about technology." Mm-hmm. Did she ever answer any of those questions? And what's your—
Yes, and in multiple different ways. Yeah. Like, not consistently. She did answer them. That was one of the interesting things. She did have, I mean, I remember at one point her telling me that she had another nanotainer that the FDA hadn't rejected, that they could just come out with. The nanotainer was the little thing that you're supposed to put the blood in. I don't think there was such a nanotainer. She always said that they'd filed all these tests with the FDA in a way that was completely different from the way the FDA worked. And the part of what worked is they were big lies. Like, they didn't seem like, if you knew the space, like they could likely be true. And the FDA normally can't process that much, but like, you couldn't say that they hadn't filed.
Now, what now, 5 years later, whatever, what's your biggest question now that you want to know?
I mean, I guess I've heard a lot of the salacious stuff, and I'm a bit of a medical geek at heart. And one of the things that was interesting is there was a randomized trial of the Theranos technology that was not run by Theranos. It was run by a scientist who's now head of R&D at Tempest Labs, who was at Mount Sinai, who went and put people in a van and drove them back and forth between Theranos and a testing center. And some of the blood values were way off, but a lot of them were on. So it seems like a lot of what Theranos was doing was just diluting these blood tests into and running them on Siemens machines. But I really do wonder what they were doing and what technology was actually there, and whether it was all really completely vaporware, and whether there was anything. They also had FDA approval for a herpes test, which was not the most amazing thing, but like, it was something. So I'm I'm really curious if we find out there was anything there. And I want to know if she was so clever that she managed to not lie to investors in a way that was provable, or if the prosecutors caught her in one or more lies where you can just say without a lot of expertise that she was telling people something that wasn't true.
Now let's go to your interviews with her on stage when you were at Forbes. When were they, and set the scene for us?
The first one was in October 2015 at an event to celebrate entrepreneurship and the Forbes 30 Under 30. And it was before things really broke. There were a lot of questions, and I think even from the questions I asked, the thesis was kind of that this couldn't be worth as much as they said, and a lot of things didn't add up. But it was before John Carreyrou wrote his first story where he really got inside the company and was able to show that there was actually nothing there.
So on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of your hype meter, that you, in terms of as a reporter covering a lot of the startups, 1 to 10, where was the hype meter, the Herper?
In terms of the amount of hype, or in terms of how?
In terms of, were you thinking in your head, she's full of it, or is?
In terms of with 10 being this is
most hype.
With this this is complete fakery.
Yeah.
And 1 being this absolutely must be true. I guess I was certainly above 5.
Yeah.
I wasn't at a 10.
I think that's fair. I think a lot of people who aren't geeks in this world, as you say you are, would probably have been more, would not have scored as well. A lot of people are taken in.
A lot of people that I talked to who were reporters in other areas were at a 1 or a 2. Like there was a sense that this person was absolutely going to change the world, and she was being offered literally every magazine cover at that point. And so I did ask her at that time, which is what that story you referenced was based. And I said in the interview, there's a lot of criticism of your technology. There are a lot of questions, and there are a lot of very smart, honest people asking questions. And she basically said that they were all paid off by the laboratory.
Right.
All the negative press was because of the large laboratory companies. So
seeing that clip from that interview, it seemed like she wasn't defensive, and she seemed to have all the answers. She exuded a certain confidence.
Mm-hmm.
What was your take on sort of her knowledge? You know, you've interviewed, hundreds, thousands of people that have started companies and so forth, and are in the health world. How did she rank in terms of how much did she impress you with her knowledge or lack thereof? In
the initial interviews, she was able to seem more knowledgeable because you were kind of shadowboxing with someone and you had no idea what. It was this really weird situation, which as a biotech reporter I'm not used to, where we really knew nothing about the machine except that there was a big deal with Walgreens, and another one there was a Blue Cross plan that signed up with her. There was a government of Mexico deal. Like all these people said that they'd vetted it. And you were trying to figure out what this thing was. As you talked to her more, the story got less consistent. I will say that in terms of having talked to entrepreneurs and the ability to create a sense that they were doing something, that they believed in what they were doing, that they were set out to change the world, that their technology was important. She was convincing. Like the only thing I can really compare it to is of people I've interacted with ever is Bill Clinton. Like it's like she was there was like this reality distortion field, to use the Steve Jobs term.
Did you say Clinton?
Clinton, yeah.
Which one?
Bill.
Okay.
The one who was charismatic.
Okay.
Not the.
That's what I thought. I did. And speaking of charisma or lack thereof, Didn't you interview Martin Shkreli around the same time?
The second Elizabeth Holmes interview, which was much tougher because we'd learned a lot about that, was one of the last things she did, was at the same event as when I interviewed Martin Shkreli, and he said in response to an audience question that he thought he should have raised the price of the drug higher.
And where was he on your 1 to 10 hype meter?
They're very different. There was always a lot of reason to be a little bit skeptical of Martin, but initially he was kind of this underdog. And he was taking on big stocks, and then he founded these little biotech companies and had some neat ideas, and then the whole pricing thing happened. So he was kind of this, you knew he was a weird personality who didn't quite have social skills. He had some connections to people who were big names in pharma. I'd spent more, the time I spent with Martin was more, I got to see Martin himself, like it was real. I got to see him acting as he was. And what he did was much more of a traditional shell game. And the fascinating thing about Martin is a lot of what he did was wrong. Raising the price of the drug that way was wrong. He did pick a few drug projects that ended up working. The one in particular. His ideas weren't all crazy. It was everything else he did that was crazy. It was the way he interacted with people. With Theranos, there was a lot of craziness going on behind the scenes, but the way Theranos presented externally wasn't crazy at all. The idea never made any sense. One of the hardest things was and the thing that made me wonder if I was wrong was that everybody else got excited about this, but I never understood how you'd value diagnostic tests are already a business where you don't make a lot of money. So I never understood why you would value it as this transformative thing to be able to do them at the drugstore quickly as opposed to getting the results a day or two later.
Has this has all played out, made you more skeptical than you would have been when you interview people? Not that you weren't sufficiently skeptical.
I hope so. It should. I was trying to be skeptical at the time. It really is. It's exciting, and hands off to John Carreyrou, who not only broke all these stories but wrote one of the best business books I've ever read. It's such a page turner, which they usually aren't. But it's depressing. It's depressing that it kind of showed the weaknesses that we have as that there was nobody. I guess in my ideal world, when a company's making claims like this and they've submitted things to the FDA moved fairly slowly, and the story was allowed to get out. It did definitely show that just because someone's raised a lot of money doesn't mean you should have any confidence in what they're saying.
Speaking of the FDA, Michael Durand has a comment, one of our viewers, why was there not more FDA oversight of their blood tests? Seems this was a major fail.
There are two answers to that. The first is that initially Theranos was regulated under what's called the homebrew system, which a lot of tests are regulated under, where they were regulated by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, not by the FDA. And the standards are different, and they'd apparently passed those tests. I think there's a fair question of whether they should have been able to operate at all, and eventually they were shut down. When they submitted to the FDA, the FDA wound up finding initially the FDA cleared the herpes test, and there was a Zika test coming. And then Theranos was saying, we've submitted, I forget, it was hundreds or thousands, some ridiculous number of tests. We're going to build everything on our machine in a year, which never seemed possible. And then the FDA did this really clever thing where they said the nanotainer, the little container device, apparently containers for blood are supposed to be FDA approved. So they said that little piece of plastic was misbranded, and they were able to completely shut them down that way. So I think they were playing with the limits of power for the FDA and CMS, and they were very clever about that. I mean, Elizabeth Holmes was saying that she was going to be the only diagnostic test company to get FDA approval for everything. She was trying to use the FDA as a shield. And one thing we've written about, Adam Feuerstein and I have both written about a lot over the years, is that we might be better off if the FDA were more forthright about things that are under review. They currently don't talk until they approve something, and it would have been great for that to be shut down.
Speaking of self-testing, it's our colleague Katie Palmer had an intriguing lead of a story the other day about Holmes and said this could have been Elizabeth Holmes' moment. And she went on to write about self-testing and these cheap diagnostic tests for COVID. Was Holmes onto something early?
Well, she wasn't the first person to say, let's make cheap, more portable diagnostic tests. I think one of the things I thought was great about Katie's story was it kind of got it by the end to that point that I was just making before, which is that we don't just get healthcare because innovations because we want them. We get them because we pay for them. And so you have to have a reason that that someone somewhere along the system is going to pay more, or at least use that device instead in like a classic Clayton Christensen disruption kind of way, to use it. And for a lot of things, I don't think people are that desperate to get a result instantly or to get a result at home. Certainly, I mean, I've used the Abbott antigen test for COVID. Last time we had a cold, everybody's noses got swabbed with that. So certainly there are cases where it will be used, but I think that's the big question for those companies is what's the value?
Right. A question from Laura DiFrancesco, who says, when you say smart money, who exactly are you thinking of? Her board was by and large totally naive to science, technology, but I'm not so sure about the people who invested. Can you supply names?
I would have to go dig up the list of investors. It's true that a lot of them were biotech naive, but they were still, I mean, Rupert Murdoch still counts as smart money, even if he's not biotech. I kind of find this argument, people have made it a lot as a kind of way of defending the venture capital system, but there have been other cases where companies got, I mean, Outcome Health didn't make as many headlines, but certainly had a lot of backers who you would have expected to be able to vet a technology in the space and didn't. So that was a company that was selling, they basically were putting ads on tablets and computer screens that was somehow going to revolutionize patient care. So, it's I think that one would expect that those caliber of investors and people with, Larry Ellison's, people with, they certainly had access to people who could have helped them vet Theranos, and that didn't happen.
On the plus side, Jordan Hinehara says, I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name, makes the point, a lot of traditional institutional healthcare investors did not back Theranos. Those smart money might have been behind Holmes, but quote unquote knowledgeable money about the field was not. So should that give us more confidence, in fact, that in some of the institutional investors in healthcare?
Sure, but that puts you in a much tougher place, doesn't it? That means that, which I think is the reality, there are investors who have very good track records. Look, everybody in biotech loses a lot and is wrong a lot. We think of the Orbimeds and the Arches and the Third Rocks and the Newbar and his folks. but that means you have to vet the quality of the person who is making the investment, and that you can't just trust that investors kind of do their jobs. And even then, I think our experience in the past few years does represent that, certainly those people are wrong a lot too. The thing about Theranos is always that it's such an egregious case, and it's such an exception. I think you do have to be kind of careful about drawing too many conclusions about everything else, because it was a really unique confluence.
One thing I wanted to get back to, in one of your interviews with Holmes, you questioned her about how secretive Theranos was, and sort of how do you overcome that, and why are you so secretive? What could you talk a little about the balance between not wanting to divulge trade secrets, but also wanting to be transparent with customers?
That's one of the big lessons I take from the experience. I do tend to think someone in healthcare who tells me that they are keeping a secret because it's a trade secret is probably keeping a secret because there's nothing there. I do tend to think there's a lot of Wizard of Oz, man behind the curtain, going on whenever anyone says that, and much more so because of Theranos. Usually stuff in healthcare is protected by patents, but even in cases where you have trade secrets, that's usually a pretty narrow thing. One thing that made it, Theranos according to Carraway's book, did some elaborate scheming to make it so that it looked like people were getting tested by the Edison machines, the little desktop machines, when their tests were actually being run on other machines, to give a fault to. So there was potentially some real deceit involved. But yeah, I think it's a good lesson not to trust anyone who says they have trade secrets in healthcare.
Do we now know once and for all that there was nothing to her technology?
No, because that's one of the things I'm hoping I learn more about from the trial, although it certainly looks like it. One of the big things that I thought was, to me, a huge dramatic moment. I think most people don't remember it, but she went and presented at the AACC toward the end of this saga. The company was already falling apart. And that's the clinical chemistry organization. And she went and presented this new version of the Edison. And it didn't do any of the stuff the Edison was supposed to do. It couldn't run all the tests the Edison was supposed to run. It was like the most, if your version 2 can't do any of the stuff you said version 1 can do, well, maybe version 1 didn't do any of it either. It was an amazing moment of chutzpah, and just an incredible example of how crazy the whole story got.
And speaking about her, one thing she knows how to do, or did know how to do, is sort of, as you say, chutzpah and marketing and so forth. As our editorial events director, you do a lot of events. Do you have any recollection of what she was like in the green room beforehand, and sort of how much hand-holding she needed? Was she different from other speakers, or just really?
First time I interviewed her, she was on top of the world. She had multiple handlers around her, but she was calm and charming and chatty and really nice, really personable, really nice. Something that changed from that point is there was, I forget exactly when it happened. Theranos went through a bunch of different public relations shops. At first, I felt like I was dealing with people who were doing PR as a side job, who'd never done it before, who didn't know anything about how the press works. Then they had like some more professional people, and there was an old pro who negotiated that second appearance, which I think they'd already confirmed it, but there were a whole bunch of stipulations that they were trying to make, none of which really affected the content of the interview, but it was much more managed. And I remember I was afraid she wasn't going to show up, and I think she showed up at the last minute, and then we talked briefly and went on stage. I do remember talking about the nanitainer and her telling me that there was a second nanitainer, and then quickly changing the topic when I brought that up on stage.
If you could sort of go back, is there any question you regret not asking?
No, I mean, there's stories I regret not writing. I mean, one of the amazing things about the story, I wrote once that I wonder if it was an advantage to John Carreyrou that she'd never talked to him.
That's interesting, because
she always offered that you were going to get it, that why don't you come out to Theranos, we'll show you everything, and then you would say, okay, let's do it, and you'd get crickets. Not just to journalists. It happened with Ethan Weiss, who was a cardiologist who was at that event. He asked a question from the audience, why don't you? And she did bring him in. He did go to Theranos, but then
probably didn't get very far.
No, right? Well, that was the thing. There were multiple curtains.
Right.
But she didn't stand out in terms of being difficult or high maintenance or anything like that. It also wasn't like, since we brought up Martin Shkreli, I remember Martin turning on like a switch when he went on stage. Like his whole mannerism would change. The farmer bro would come out. And that I don't remember being struck by anything like that with Holmes.
Did you find either of them personally likable?
Both in kind of a strange way, I guess. I guess I admired Martin's ability to think when I first met him. I admired just kind of all the crazy ideas and willingness to try them. With her, I guess I felt more skepticism. They're both infuriating also. People have given them all kinds of diagnoses, and I think the Theranos thing was terrible, but she was charming. I don't know that finding someone charming is the same as liking them. I don't think I liked her. I think, but she was one of those people where you liked her more when she was talking to you, no matter no matter how mad you were beforehand. Like she knew, and she acted like she was being very open to criticism, but then you would listen to what she said and she wasn't.
Right. No, that's fascinating. I know you're obviously not a lawyer, but were you surprised by her sort of the defense that her lawyers are talking about, the harassment, abuse by her co-conspirator, Sunny Balwani?
No, it seemed, I guess that seemed like a likely defense to me anyway, just that she would somehow be blaming Balwani, and there was the relationship, and it is, she was a very young woman, and he was the very much older man who had business experience. Like this is definitely, if you were going to write fiction around this, you would go in that direction. I don't know. It could be true. We don't know. I guess I'm done being surprised by anything about Elizabeth Holmes. But I don't think that's the most, it's interesting that they seem to be leaning into a mental health defense. That's going to come down to real hard ethical questions for the jury about what does someone have to be going through to make this okay, right? To give lots of people potassium blood tests that gave them the wrong potassium levels, to give lots of people blood tests that told them they're sick when they're not. to be willfully doing that. There's no excuse.
Right.
So I mean, a lot of people are charming, right? That's how people get ahead in business. But and a lot of people have problems, but your problems don't make everything that you do okay. It's not an excuse. So I'm not surprised by it.
Matt, you mentioned fiction, and the thing that there's kind of a subplot here that's fascinated me for years, and that's the George and Tyler Schultz subplot, which I think could be a play. Which is, as we know, George Schultz, the late Secretary of State, was a huge benefactor and supporter and investor. His grandson Tyler worked for her and became a whistleblower, and his own grandfather.
Not just a whistleblower, he was basically the whistleblower.
Yeah.
He was the one sending stuff to Carrier at the Journal.
Right. But his grandfather sided with her and not him.
Initially, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I find it shocking too, especially we talk about people you've met. I mean, he's really nice, Tyler. I've interviewed him on stage too, and
genuine,
super genuine guy. I mean, it's coming with he also did this great thing at personal risk and showing real courage. So it is a fascinating story. I don't know what's going to be interesting. He got kind of a boost in his public person, was starting a company through that. So it'll be interesting to see how he learns from this, or if more comes of it. I mean, it doesn't have to. You can do the right thing at the beginning and even try to put together. I mean, the thing that I guess when we're talking about Holmes and Shkreli and also other kind of people in biotech and pharma who were not the best actors, the thing when the system works, terrible people sometimes come up with wonderful medical products that save lives, and wonderful people often fail at developing those same types of products. And so I guess I always keep coming back to that as a thought here. And that's kind of the problem, is that, just because someone is crooked doesn't mean they're wrong. But he certainly stood out as somebody who was really smart and really upstanding, and also he was quite charming as a person.
And I would say, I don't know if it's a step too far to say courageous in what he did.
Oh, I don't think it's a step too far, especially since he was willing to. I mean, I guess part of what eventually led him to put his name out there was that he was being so harassed by David Boies and Holmes's lawyer, and there's a character in all of this that does not come off looking well.
Right.
Was just so willing to back is so willing to
Let me ask you a question from Timothy Tankozik, who asks, is there any evidence of deaths caused by Theranos' deceit, incorrect or delayed diagnoses directly tied to patient death?
It's a very good question. I haven't looked into it recently, and there may be some. Usually when people got one of these bad test results, their response would be to go to a doctor, and often the tests were probably repeated. So that's kind of a saving grace of this, as opposed to if it were something that was more urgent. But I wouldn't be surprised if there were some. There were a reasonable number of people. The rollout of the business was really much smaller than we all thought. There was really just this little bit of testing going on in Arizona, if I remember correctly. I don't think that it ever became as wide as, one of the things that was driving the story from a business perspective is that, that deal with Walgreens sounded huge. They were going to roll this out in all their stores. How could a company like that be falling a victim entirely to vaporware? Something I do want to answer that I saw here from Howard Hochester, asking, every claim they made defies experience with analytics from mass spec and liquid chromatography, as well as physics itself. Anybody who ever worked with multi-channel clinical analyzers would know this could not be. How could these falsehoods be propagated? I have a really good answer to that, actually, which is that I think a lot of us who were science reporters who knew a bit about medicine, enough to be dangerous, right? Knew something was up and something was wrong. As the story developed, as it got more headlines, people started to come out of the woodwork, as sources do, and you could find lots of people who were willing to explain what didn't work and what was wrong. And also, it really came to specific tests. It came to things like potassium and how do you do whole blood cell counts with the volume of blood that small and things like that. But something I think we all find as reporters very often, is that people don't like to speak out, and people who have authority, who actually know, probably, I feel like they're less likely to talk about things than they were when I started doing this 20 years ago. I feel like there's a whole bunch of anonymous sniping on social media, but that people aren't as eager to be sources, or they're eager to be sources on background, and they think they can talk to you and not tell you anything, and you as the journalist take all the risk. And I understand that, because being quoted in the story means that you get hate mail from all those terrible voices on social media, and it may not be, it used to be good for your career in almost every profession, and now it may be bad. There's a cultural thing. But it's definitely a cultural thing that I think makes it harder for us to do our jobs. Because I don't think, there were some stories that tried to approach that, but no one really nailed it until Carrier, and it wasn't because there were so many people who understood it, who were willing to speak out, who could talk about what was wrong. It was because he was able to get people on the inside.
Right. We're almost out of time, but let me ask a couple quick questions because we have such good ones coming in. Bradley Nelson says, opinion rather than question, but it's pretty interesting. He says, obvious that Holmes is an opportunist, as was Scully, but systemic failures seem to fall on institutional oversight or lack thereof. Recent stat articles on the FDA approval process seem to underscore a major overhaul is needed there. Holmes just exploited yet another major gap in our system and was financially backed by others that are either ignorant or complicit. I side on ignorance, he says. What do you say to that?
The FDA was actually trying to close some of the regulatory loopholes that she used. They were trying to move more tests to having to be pre-approved. And some of that happened after Theranos. But generally, over the course of my career, over the past 20 years, I feel like the FDA has been in a huge deregulatory cycle. The bar has been being lowered, with some periods where something went horribly wrong and caused it to go back up before it went back down, with Vioxx and Paxil being the big one, key tech, all the drug safety controversies of the early 2000s. I mean, from what I've seen, it does certainly seem to me that stronger regulators make for better medical products. So I think there's a lot to that comment.
And Michael Long says that given the stature of the investors in Walgreens, how did due diligence fail? Does that imply fabrication of data?
So many of these parties don't seem to have done even basic due diligence. Some of them were deceived by going in and doing and seeing the test work, which was something you could do. You could go to the Theranos clinics where they were set up and try them out and see if they got your cholesterol right? And there are some well-known investors who were very public that they did that and didn't invest because of that. But a lot of people were willing to invest with no clinical data, with no idea what the technical specs were, with really not much of anything at all. And then someone asked about Tim Draper backing it. I think that certainly helped it take off. And they did basically play this game of going to people and saying, you know, do you want in or not? And doing it under high pressure, and that works. So, so I think more than the due diligence failing, I think the proper due diligence was not done. I think a lot of people were going based on, well, I've met this person, they seem really interesting, what a great idea. Also, sometimes big investors can put down a lot of money that's not a lot of money for them. Rupert Murdoch or Larry Ellison can afford to lose some money. But sometimes that investment then leads other people to feel like they need to get in. It really is hard to get across. It's hard. I have to go back and look at notes from that time to remember how different things felt about startups then. There really was this idea that they were all taking over the world. And I think a lot of people were caught up on that and saw this as the latest. And then, you know, the press, you know, that she was this, she was a young woman, which was unheard of. And that led to a lot of support. So
let me ask you, my final question is, how wrapped are you going to be in watching this on Zoom as the trial unfolds? And are there any particular witnesses you're hoping to see?
Right now, I'm not planning to be too wrapped, and you haven't, you know, assigned me to watch the whole thing.
But let me just assure everyone.
And have assigned me to do other things.
And we
I
have
want
a
to tell you,
team.
I'm going to be watching TV all day.
But let me also assure everyone we have a team of stat reporters that will write about this.
Yes, yes. But right now I'm not pulled in, but I kind of expect to be. I actually went to the Shkreli trial. And one of the things I found there was it was kind of hard to keep track, and you are often better off. And now I'll be able to watch the clips on YouTube. So I might be taking a strategy of seeing what's interesting and watching it later, like we all do streaming. I'm not that at the same time when she testifies, I'm going to be wrapped to that. I want to see if she is different from the person I interviewed. And I am interested in, I guess it depends what kind of case they make and who gets called to testify. I mean, if some of these big names are called to testify too, some of the big investors, that's going to be must-see TV as well.
Yeah.
I guess, I mean, my expectation, I'll be surprised if this ends with her not being charged, not being convicted of anything. But we'll see.
Well, you've been this has been fascinating. You're so thoughtful about this, and it's great hearing your perspectives on her and the impacts for all of us. So appreciate it.
Do we have any more comments from?
There's been a really good sort of
chat,
a lot of people chatting among themselves. So I think we've covered most of it.
Great comments in here. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Connie Luthi correcting me that her first clinical lab director was Caribou's original source. Okay, yeah, that's true. And arguing again the never-ending argument about who qualifies as smart money. When I say smart money, I mean rich people. I'm just trying to be a little more rich people and investors with a lot of money to throw around. Okay. Well, thanks, Rick.
Well, thank you.